Welcome to Women in Business Around the World, a series of lightning talks. My name is Carla Ruffer, and I am the Outreach Coordinator for the Center for European Studies at the University of Florida. The speakers in this series will discuss their experience as women in business or their research on women in business in relation to Europe, the Middle East, and globally. These talks are designed to provide flashes of information and insight, but you are welcome to follow up with the presenters independently or to reach out to us. So without further ado, let's begin.
Our next speaker is Ezgi Kaya. She will speak on understanding the gender pay gap. Dr. Kaya is a lecturer in economics at Cardiff University and a fellow at the Global Labor Organization. Her expertise is in the area of empirical labor economics. She has worked on a variety of policy relevant issues, but has a particular interest in gender equality in the labor market. Dr. Kaya, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Deborah. Thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone, or good morning or good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you, Deborah, for this kind introduction. And also thanks to all organizers for the invitation and for organizing this series of interesting talks. So the first part of my talk today will focus on the key facts about the gender pay gap. I will show you a series of figures, mostly based on data from European countries, but also across the globe. And I will try to highlight what are the common patterns and potential drivers of the gender wage gaps that we observe. And in the second part of my talk, I will discuss the measurement issues and the strategies that are commonly adopted to address the gender pay gap that we observe. Perhaps the most striking fact is the presence of a substantial gender pay gap in most countries. So the figure here presents the cross-sectional data from a sample of European countries. Each bar here represents the estimate for each country, which corresponds to differences between average hourly earnings of men and women, expressed as a percentage of average hourly earnings of men. Here we are looking at all workers, irrespective of their characteristics or whether they work part-time or full-time. As we can see, in most countries, the gap is positive. That is, women earn less than men, and there are large differences in the size of this gap across countries. For example, if we look at European Union average as a whole in 2019, women's gross hourly earnings were on average 14.1% below those of men, and the figure is quite similar in the Euro area as well. So the EU average is slightly smaller than the US figure, which corresponds to 20%. However, what we see is a substantial variation across countries, partly due to varying female labor force participation rates, as well as different institutional and cultural environments. So how is the gap changing over time? To answer this question, let's consider this figure. This shows us the available estimates from a sample of European countries as well as the US. The estimates here come from a different data source, so the measurement is slightly different, but the message is the same. So we see a positive gap over time for the sample of countries that we are looking at. But what we also see is that the gap has decreased in the last couple of decades across all the countries that we are looking at. But in most OECD countries that are not included in this figure, we see similar trends. In some cases, the reduction is remarkable. For example, for the UK, the dark blue solid line here, gap went down from almost 50% in 1970s to about 17% in 2016. Despite having fallen in recent decades, there still remains a substantial pay gap between men and women. But what does gender pay gap look like if we focus on different points of the pay distribution? Do we find any evidence of the so-called glass ceiling? That is a wider gender pay gap at the top of the distribution in this context. The figure that I show you here allows us to answer this question by showing the data again for various OECD countries. The closed triangle here represents the gender pay gap at the top end of the pay distribution, and the open square shows the gap among the lowest paid. The figure shows us that the gender pay gaps are often widest among the top earners, reflecting the difficulty for women to advance in labor markets. For instance, if we look at the OECD average here, the difference between the gap at the top and at the bottom end of the pay distribution is about 10 percentage points, indicating a glass ceiling effect for women that they face in the labor market. Obviously, these aggregate pay gaps might underestimate the extent of the gender pay gap across different groups. In fact, empirical evidence suggests that gender pay gap varies to a great extent for different groups of workers. For instance, women are found to be overrepresented in part-time jobs, perhaps as a consequence of the traditional household division of labor, which typically carries a lower accepted wage rate than full-time work. In this figure, the gender pay gap is analyzed from the perspective of part-time or full-time employment, again, for a sample of European countries. The orange bar here represents the gender pay gap among part-time men and women, while the blue bar is the estimate for full-time workers. What we see is that in 2019, the gender pay gap for part-time workers varied from around -5% in Italy to 22% in Croatia. A negative, a minus gender pay gap means that on average, women's gross hourly earnings are higher than those of men. However, this is often due to a selection bias that we call, especially when the employment rate is lower for women than for men. In other words, women engaging in the labor markets may have comparatively higher skills and education levels than men, and as a result, we observe a negative gender pay gap. Another dimension that appears to be important in the context of gender pay gap is public versus private sector. In the majority of European countries, the gender pay gap is found to be wider in the private sector than that in the public sector. For instance, as illustrated in this figure with an orange bar, in 2019, the majority of the European countries recorded a higher gender pay gap in the private sector than in the public sector. The academic evidence put forward several potential explanations to explain why this might be the case. These include distinctive nature of the public sector in holding cultural values as a fair employer and offering greater provision of flexible working and family-friendly practices. There may also be indirect effects due to centralized pay setting, collective bargaining, more transparent and structured pay systems within the public sector, which may then influence the pay distribution and hence the gender pay gap that we observe. Today, pay differences are much better explained by differences in occupations that men and women are employed in than, for instance, by education. In fact, this is consistent with the evidence from the US. Since education expanded significantly over the last few decades, it has become less important in explaining gender differences in pay. However, we also know that there's substantial variation in pay gap between occupations. In an earlier work for the UK, where we examined the gender pay gap in the UK public sector occupations, what we found was a substantial variation across public sector occupations. For instance, in the figure, I try to illustrate the pay gap among selected public sector occupations. For instance, the first blue bar here shows the pay gap among doctors and dentists, which is about 20%, and this is around 4 times that of workers in the National Health Service. The last dimension I would like to emphasize is age. The pay gap is generally much lower for new labor market entrants and tends to widen with age. However, those differences over age groups can have different patterns across the countries as illustrated in this figure. Here, what we did is that we calculated the gender pay gap for different age brackets for a sample of European countries. What we observe here as a common pattern is that there are important differences by age within each country. But the second point might be a little bit more crucial in understanding the pay gap. What we see is that the gender pay gap is a statistic that changes over the life cycle of a worker. In most European countries, as well as in the US, it's small when formal education ends and employment begins, and it increases with age. The gap might increase with age as a result of the career interruptions women may experience during their working life, particularly when they marry and when or if they have children. It's also important here to note that gender pay gap is a metric that tells us the difference in pay between men and women. It's a measure of inequality and captures a concept that's broader than the concept of equal pay for equal work. As we have seen in the figures that we just looked at, differences in pay between men and women may capture differences along many possible dimensions, including working hours, age, sector of employment, and occupation. When the gender pay gap is calculated by comparing all male workers to all female workers, irrespective of these gender differences, the result is the raw or unadjusted pay gap. On the contrary, when the gap is calculated after accounting for underlying differences in characteristics, then the result is the adjusted pay gap. The implication is that observing differences in pay between men and women is neither necessary nor sufficient to prove discrimination in the workplace. Both are important concepts, but discrimination and inequality are not one and not the same. However, we have econometric tools that often enable us to estimate an unexplained gap. That is, we are able to look at the gender pay difference for observationally equivalent men and women. And the figure now I show you is from the Statistical Office of the European Union, Eurostat, and it shows the evolution of this unexplained gender pay gap in European Union countries. Here we are looking at men and women with similar labor market characteristics. When countries are ranked according to their unexplained gender pay gap, the picture changes compared to the raw gender pay gap figures that I showed you previously, with some countries moving by more than 10 positions after taking into account these gender differences in characteristics. Nevertheless, at EU level, the unexplained gender pay gap is around 11.4%. This means that women still earn less than men on average after correcting for their different average characteristics. Many factors may drive the wage gap that we observe, but there is no one straightforward solution to close it. In the European Union, there is a broad policy strategy to foster gender equality that's common across its member states. And the key elements of this strategy include family-friendly labor market policies to improve access to childcare facilities and paid leave. These are known to boost women's labor force participation. There have been also attempts to equalize the gender distribution of unpaid care work, including getting fathers more involved in caring and promoting more equal forms of paid leave. Efforts to reduce segregation in the labor market also aim to address issues around concentration of women in low-paid occupations and firms and at low-paid grades or positions within organizations. Equal pay laws and anti-discrimination laws have been crucial for ensuring workers' rights and exist widely throughout the OECD countries. As part of these efforts to close gender pay gaps, many countries are also implementing promising new pay transparency tools. These include employer pay gap reporting, equal pay audits, and job classification systems. These measures offer a relatively simple tool to identify and address organizational pay gaps, but their design and implementation matter. For instance, in the UK, since 2017, large organizations are required to calculate and publicly report their organizational pay gap. And this is part of a strategy to make pay gaps more transparent and encourage employers to explore and address its drivers. In fact, UK is not an exception. In 18 OECD countries, we see a systematic and regular gender pay gap reporting by private sector firms. Within this group, 9 countries implemented more comprehensive legislations that require additional gender data analysis and typically propose follow-up strategies to address inequalities. Most of these policies were introduced in the past decades, and most of this movement took place in Europe. Many of these pay reporting covered the public sector as well. And additionally, in some other countries, we see job classification systems. These attempt to standardize pay and make it transparent across men and women within specific job categories. So these systems are often embedded within equal pay auditing processes, suggesting that they may become more widespread if pay auditing policies gain momentum. Because most pay transparency policies are relatively new, there has been limited academic research carried out evaluating their effectiveness. So the available evidence has largely concentrated on company pay reporting regulations. These studies have typically found small reductions in the gender pay gap when reporting measures are accompanied by the threat of sanctions or relatively high public visibility, as is the case in the UK as well as in Denmark. However, where enforcement mechanism or pay gap visibility is weaker, these measures seem to have had fewer positive effects. However, studies looking at smaller and targeted populations of workers, such as university faculty in Canada and the United States, have found that publishing salaries helps to close the gender pay gap. I would like to conclude my talk noting that although the academic evidence base is still being built, pay transparency policies hold significant appeal, and pay transparency measures represent a tool both to identify and to take action against the wage gap in the workplace. However, the preliminary evidence suggests that their design and implementation really matter. This concludes my presentation, and thank you for your attention. And I think I will hand over to Deborah.
Thank you, Dr. Kaya. And I want to extend a heartfelt thank you, as do all of my colleagues, to the audience for joining us, to our speakers for sharing their expertise, and the U.S. Department of Education. We are especially grateful to them because without Title VI funding for national resource centers, we'd be unable to present this program to you. Be sure to check out all of our centers, where we hope to see you at another presentation or talk in the future. Thank you all very much, and have a good rest of your morning, afternoon, or evening. And thank you on behalf of all of us.